tonight's show, John Hopwood gave over to me, and I'm going to talk about something that's really sensitive and not something most Americans feel very comfortable talking about. I am going to talk about suicide and suicide prevention. So, there's been a couple reasons I wanted to talk about this, and one of them was a bill was passed in the Senate last week, which was SB 282, and that required school districts and charter schools to have facility staff volunteers to be trained in youth suicide risk factors, warning signs, protective factors, response procedures, referrals, positive interventions, and resources available in schools and communities. It requires education for students and recognizing risk factors and warning signs, mental disorders, and suicide. So I think the state of New Hampshire has a really good intention of being helpful, but the state's motto is live free or die, and I think sometimes we really encompass that to a debilitating standpoint. And so this theme has been coming into my life the last couple days, and I have myself, being a woman in recovery and struggling with like my own mental health issues, have attempted suicide 3 times, and it's not a graceful thing. It's not something that you feel very comfortable talking about, but it's a reality for a lot of people. So the Senate in New Hampshire passed this bill, and then within the last weekend, I would say, there has been some movement within the media based on some stories that we have dealt with in the last couple years. And so I brought someone who is much more articulate than me, much more educated than me, who can give a better understanding, a better narrative on this issue. So I'm going to introduce my really amazing friend, Sara Guerra. Hi, Sara.
Hi, Nikki. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good.
So, Sara, I just, for people listening, if you could just give a background of your education, your what you've dealt with in the workforce, and maybe, you've had some personal stuff. So whatever you feel comfortable talking about as an introduction, and then we can go into the nitty-gritty.
Great. Thank you. My name is Sara Guerra. I am a suicide prevention specialist with an agency or a program called Riverside Trauma Center, which is based in the Boston metro area. I've been there almost 7 years, which is hard to believe. And I like to tell people that I specialize in men, but actually what I specialize in is men's mental health and suicide prevention. I've been in the mental health field for 20 years, and I'm really happy to tell you that I actually am a graduate of Antioch University, New England, in Keene, New Hampshire. But what brought me to this work is that I am also a suicide loss survivor.
Yeah.
When I was 20 years old, I lost my best friend to suicide, and it really shaped me as a human being, and it certainly shaped my career.
So, there's so many different directions we could go down. So, when you say, for you, being a suicide loss survivor, so you lost someone very close to you who died by suicide, how did that impact?
That's correct.
Yeah. So how did that impact you?
Well, it's interesting. When we talk about suicide loss, people often focus on, the grief of losing somebody that you love to suicide. But so often there's, months and even years of distress that happened before that suicide death. So for me, I had watched my friend struggle and suffer immensely and actually have multiple suicide attempts before she ultimately died.
Yeah.
You know, it was very traumatic. It was terrifying. It was confusing. It was also a long time ago. And so while suicide is still very taboo, it was even more taboo back then.
Yeah.
And so there was no training that I was aware of. There was no post-vention services, which is when, grief counselors come in and help survivors cope with the reactions. And so, it really impacted me. And I would say for a solid year, I was somewhat paralyzed with, both the trauma and the grief of losing such a good friend to suicide.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, no, I appreciate that you sort of stress the suicide loss survivor because, sometimes people use just the term suicide survivor, and then folks don't know what that means. And so, we do try to differentiate between a suicide loss survivor and a suicide attempt survivor.
Yeah.
And both of those voices are really, really important when we talk about suicide.
Well, I think it's very similar. So I have, on multiple occasions, attempted suicide. And I am also a woman who has battled addictions. But I know what I have put my family through also makes them survivors. I know my struggles are not unique, and it's not single to my own issues. I have affected many people with my issues, and I think we can, go deeper into that within the next hour, but I think it's really important to discuss when someone struggles with addiction or mental illness issues, that it affects a lot of us.
It does. Yeah, we talk a lot about the importance of, family and friends taking good care of themselves emotionally, because watching somebody you love struggle and suffer, it can be really devastating as a bystander.
Yeah. I think we're at this really interesting moment in history where we're watching a lot of people trying to communicate that stuff, maybe more. So you can absolutely correct me if I'm wrong. So I think, from working in the field and being a woman in recovery and reading the big book, I can see that there's this evolution happening. Like, we're giving more space to different dynamics of mental illness. But it's still killing us at a faster rate.
I think both of those things are true, and it's why sometimes, we get really discouraged, because it feels on one hand like we're talking more and we're doing more trainings and we're doing more of all these things, and yet, we're still losing more and more people to suicide and opioids and alcohol every year. And it's because the two things aren't mutually exclusive, right? It's not cause and effect in the sense that just because we've started talking more about it, it fixes all of the other, sort of root causes or drivers of those issues. It's talking about it's just one really important step, but there's a lot of other pieces that need to come into play.
So, when I came across the bill, the Senate or SB 282, and just reiterating what it said. So, requires facilities, staff, volunteers within school districts and charter schools to be trained in youth suicide risk factors, warning signs, protective factors, response procedures, referrals, post-intervention, and resources available. So when I was reading about this bill, I think it was like the second or third line to drive the point home about this bill was, after unintentional injury, suicide is the leading cause of death for young people ages 10 to 24 years old. Unintentional injuries which cause death are on the decline, but suicide is on the rise. So, So what could be, if we keep going in the direction we're going in, what could be the number one cause for 10 to 24-year-olds is suicide.
Yeah. There's a lot of ways to think about all of the data that's out there. And one of the things is that when we talk about that age bracket in particular, we're very fortunate in the sense that there aren't a lot of other things that kill young people in that age bracket.
Well, the only thing ahead of that was unintentional hurt, like unintentional, issues.
Right, but if you look at the middle age bracket, which is the age group that I specialize in,
yep.
right, suicides, it's the top 10. It's the 10th leading cause of death for them. But that's because there's a lot of other things that people in the middle age bracket can die from, such as, heart attacks, cancer. So those things are a lot higher on the list. We're actually losing a lot more middle-aged folks in America than we are youth. Mm-hmm. And that's not to say that youth suicide isn't tragic, because it is tragic, and it's especially tragic in a couple of ways. One, when we look at the ripple of a youth suicide, young people are often in contact with many, many people, which means when we lose a young person, there's going to be a lot of grieving survivors behind. And the other piece of it is, young people have their entire life ahead of them. And so when we count up sort of the years of life lost, it is significantly higher when it's a young person. And the third part of it, which is what makes a bill like what you're talking about really important, is when we look at older Americans, impulsivity is not considered to be a big driving force behind suicide. But when we look at youth, we have reason to believe, and I'm saying that on purpose because we're still researching, but we have reason to believe that impulsivity is a significantly larger factor for young people. And so teaching as many people as possible, in the schools, teachers, counselors, how to recognize a child who would have an elevated risk, and also how to watch for any warning signs and intervene appropriately, is a really important step forward in youth suicide prevention.
So when you say impulsivity, what does that mean?
So, when we think about older adults, the research that's out there, and there may be something newer that's come out, but suggested that older adults had thought about suicide, for quite some time before they actually made the attempt. Whereas when we look at the data around young people, I believe, don't hold me to this number, but I believe 30% of them will make the attempt the same day as the trigger event. And it's important to understand that the trigger event isn't necessarily the cause. The trigger event is whatever's happened that sort of, heightens the distress. Yep. So that could be an incident of bullying. It could be, having somebody break up with them. What we know about suicide, and this is maybe the most important thing I'll say, is that suicide is almost always a multifactorial event.
Right.
And what that means is it's not just one thing that caused it, but it's a series of things that came together. And so when we look at young people, we know that impulsivity is more likely to be a factor than for older people.
So I think this is a really good segue to go into what we had talked about. So luckily for me, Sara Guerra, is, she is such a backbone for the things that I believe in, and I can bounce anything off of her, and I'm really grateful for her. So, we had talked about something last night, and there was no plan of Sara hopping on the phone today, and it kind of happened right before we, got on air, and so I think it's just a really good moment to just kind of focus in on this stuff. So one thing that you talked about was, and that you focus on in your career, is middle-aged men, right?
Yep.
So kind of leading into that, I think, so we'll do a 3-point discussion, and the first point we'll bring up in 2 seconds. But so our country has had a lot of mass shooting incidences. And last year, in Stoneman Douglas High School, which was in Parkland, Florida, there was a mass shooting. And then prior to that, I think we can all, kind of remember Sandy Hook shooting, and we lost children. So within the last couple days, there has been 3 suicides based on survivor's guilt, which I had never really considered until I, heard this. And so Sarah's going to kind of walk us through the dialogue of that. But one of the people within the last couple days, Monday, Jeremy Richmond, who is the father of Avelle Richmond, who died during the Sandy Hook shooting. I believe she was in the 1st grade, and her father went on to create a foundation in her name dedicated to preventing violence and building compassion through brain research and community engagement. And on Monday, he killed himself. And then over the weekend, I think from Friday to Sunday, we lost Sydney Alio and a second survivor of the Stoneham Douglas High School shooting, which was in Parkland, Florida. His name has not been released. But what's been the link to it is survivor's guilt, trauma. So Sarah, I just kind of want to ask your opinion on, this is heavy stuff. This is not bleak. This is bleak, and it's not, there's nothing to sugarcoat. This is a father who lost his child and 2 teenagers who experienced trauma due to gun violence.
Yeah, I have seen a couple of articles talking about the survivor's guilt, but I think the piece I want to say about that is survivor's guilt. That idea it's very, very common. People experience survivor's guilt all the time and don't take their lives. To me, what stands out sort of the most in this is the role of both trauma and traumatic grief. And there's a difference in traumatic grief, from grief versus traumatic grief. We've all experienced grief, whether it was losing a beloved pet or an elderly grandparent. Grief is really different from traumatic grief, because traumatic grief is often very unexpected. It often includes violence. It often includes, thoughts about or fears of somebody you love dying in a really horrible way.
Yeah.
And so, the survivor's guilt is just one piece of all of that in my mind. But I think the other thing, going back to the idea of suicide as a multifactorial event, even in these 3, I don't know anything about the young man who has not been named, other than that he was a young man who had been at, at the Douglas School. But as far as both Sydney and Jeremy, we know that both of them had both trauma and grief. So already we know that it was multifactorial. There was more than one thing happening for them. But when I think about that, Dad, the other thing that I think about is, and actually I don't want to take credit for this because it was a colleague of mine who brought it up. But just a week earlier, there had been a mass shooting in New Zealand. And within, 48 hours or so, New Zealand banned a certain type of firearm.
Assault rifle?
I imagine that if I was a father who had lost my child, and I believe his daughter was 6 when she was murdered at Sandy Hook.
Yes.
If I was a father who had lost my child to gun violence, and then for 6 years I fought to change those laws and really didn't make much progress, and all of a sudden in another part of the world, a horrific, mass shooting happens, and that nation responds
within
in 48 hours.
Yeah.
And that's the piece when we talk about suicide that's really important, is understanding that there's an underlying hopelessness that happens. We talk about the role of depression and the role of substance use, and all of those things are true. We know them to be factors in suicide. But if somebody said, Sarah, what's the number one thing that has to exist in order for someone to take their lives? My answer would be that they've lost all hope.
Yeah.
And that sounds really grim, except, to be honest with you, helping someone find hope can actually be a lot easier than fixing grief or fixing depression. And so that's why, just to bring it back to the bill that you talked about at the beginning, that's why having those types of programs, whether it's, the programs for kids, like the SOS program that I'm a big advocate of, or programs for adults like Question, Persuade, and Refer, that teach everyday people how to recognize somebody who may be struggling and how to help them, is so important. Because we hear all the time, that I was thinking about killing myself, but then this person reached out to me and was kind. And it helped me, want to stay alive. And so those programs are really, really important for suicide prevention.
Well, it's really, I know we've had, me and Sara have had many discussions about, mental health issues, addiction issues, suicide issues. And so I try to be as open as possible about my own struggles with mental health issues and addiction issues. So Sara was actually drove me up to Brattleboro, Vermont, and brought me to a detox. And I was not in a good space, and I have to detox. And for the first time in my life, and there's a lot of reasons I felt this way. For the first time in my life, dealing with substance use issues and my mental health issues, my first thought was not suicide. And that's progress. But there was a lot of factors that helped me get to that point. And a lot of it was education, life experience, community. Community is a huge point. And I think that's when, a lot of people who struggle with addiction talk about that community aspect. And do you think, Sara, that we're missing that with the mental health community aspect? That, the community.
Yeah, I think yes, and, another part of that is you and I have talked very openly about suicide all along, and not many people have someone that they can do that with.
Yeah.
And so when people are thinking about suicide, they often, feel like there's just nowhere to turn, because if they talk about it in any way, they're going to be forced into a hospital, or, and that's, sort of the worst case scenario for some folks, but even, the best case scenario is my father won't love me anymore, or my mother won't trust me anymore, or my friend won't respect me anymore. And so that's why, creating a culture and a community, like you're saying, that can talk openly and without fear about suicide is so important. And, Nikki, we know by the research that we've done that literally millions of people think about suicide. It's not as rare as people think.
No.
And the good news is, of all the people who think about suicide, it's a very small fraction of them who actually make an attempt.
Yep.
And an even smaller fraction who die. But we act as though this is rare, and it's just not.
And you know what? It's so not. It's so not rare. And I think the more we just talk about the fact we have these thoughts, the better. And I remember one time, so fun fact, me and Sara very frequently talk early in the morning. And I was working at a job one time, and we almost talked every single day on my way to my job. And I was really struggling with my mental health at this point, and it was prior to my most recent relapse, and I was just really struggling with my mental health. And Sara asked me one day, she goes, "Do you feel suicidal?" And she was the only person who asked me, and the only person I told the answer to, and I was like, "Yes, I do." and this is the best advice I have ever been given. She was like, well, you feel suicidal. It's like when the check engine light goes on in your car. It's just letting you know that there's something wrong. And it made me feel really normal. Like, I just didn't feel healthy in my mind. I didn't want to kill myself, but did I have thoughts of killing myself? Yes. Did I want to actually do anything about it? No. And for someone to actually validate my feelings that these thoughts were going on absolutely altered my mental health. It really did. Because I had never had anyone tell me, this is okay. You're actually okay. You're not a horrible person. You're not going to do a horrible thing. You just don't feel good right now. And mental...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
We hear that. I hear that all the time. I had a gentleman that I had been called to work with a long time ago, and he was clearly going through a lot of things in his life and really struggling and struggling to see his path out of all of it. And I said, I need to ask you, are you thinking about suicide? And he said, well, that's why I had them call you. And I said, okay. And I said, well, I'm wondering on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being that you're absolutely, you're definitely going to do something that could end your life, and 1 being that it's impossible, where do you feel like you are? And he said, well, like a 3. And I said, oh, I'm not that worried about a 3. And he said, you're not? And I said, no. I said, that tells me that the check engine light's on. And, we need to pay attention, and we need to try to get, you to some supports, but I'm not freaking out over that. And he looked at me, and he let this big breath out, and he said, oh, thank God. I thought I had lost my mind.
Oh, my God. Well, that's the thing, is that when you said that to me, I felt normal. And I actually use that quite a bit with my clients. And it resonated with them. They're like, oh, so I'm not this total basket case. I'm like, no. Like, sometimes your brain tells you things you don't feel good about.
Well, and you know what, Nikki? Let's face it. We all need to hear sometimes that we're okay, right?
Exactly.
Whether it's a mistake we made or, the way that we were thinking about. Sometimes we just need someone else to say, I hear you, and I see you, and I still love you, and I'm here for you.
Yep.
And we don't necessarily need people to save the day and fix everything, but we need them to just hear us and see us.
Yeah.
And that's the thing with all of these trainings, which I'm a huge proponent and advocate of, is really giving people the skills to have that conversation with someone.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I do a lot of post-vention work, which is when we go into a community or workplace after there's been a suicide death.
Yeah.
And, often we hear people say, I knew something was wrong, I was worried about him or her, I just didn't know how to approach it.
Yeah.
And, that's we call, it's actually sort of referred to as the tyranny of hindsight,
What does that mean?
We think it's really important. What's that?
What does that mean?
So the tyranny of hindsight, this is especially true with suicide, but it could probably be applied to all sorts of other, violent incidences. But when you lose somebody to suicide, you spend a lot of time replaying in your mind every conversation, every moment, and thinking about all of the times that you could have intervened or you should have intervened or you should have known something was wrong.
Yeah.
And of all the things that suicide loss survivors deal with, the tyranny of hindsight is probably the most painful because it really feels like if only I had done this, she or he would still be here. Yeah. And that's one of the real beasts about suicide is we never know, right? There's never any knowing. So what I say to people is the only benefit of hindsight is foresight. For me, all of those hours I spent thinking about my friend and all that happened to her, I take all of that information into my work now. And it's a way that I've made meaning out of her loss.
Yeah.
But it's really important, to be sort of careful around spending a lot of time thinking about what we could have done differently. With that said, in my mind, one of the ways that we protect people from that tyranny of hindsight is by giving them the skills to be able to talk to somebody and intervene. Because what I find from people is the reason they didn't talk to their friend or their family member is because they didn't know how to.
Yeah. And
so it's our hope.
And then going back to, so they didn't know how to talk to their, family member, and the family member didn't know how to talk to them.
Right.
Yeah. And that was like a big conversation that we had with each other, because after my relapse, you were one of the first people that I told.
Yeah.
And that was, it was, how can I help you? Are you okay? I'm not here to judge you. And you went on the road with me. Yeah.
Well,
we went.
You know what though? You're
Go ahead.
A couple of times, if I remember correctly, we had road trips. But you bring up a really important point, which is, the most important people in someone's lives aren't the people who show up that day. They're the people who are always there. And the power of the conversation that you and I had, it wasn't because I'm an expert. It's because we're friends.
And we had been friends for 4 years prior to that.
And we've had that relationship.
Yep. And I think, so for me, as a woman who has struggled with addiction issues and mental health issues, like, I have a really good support system. I know that that's not always the case. And that's why community is so important. That's why education is so important. So the next thing I kind of want to go into is the language aspect of it and how important that is. And that's something that we had talked about. You're like, well, Nikki, if I had said this or if I had approached it this way, would you have opened up to me? And it was, you're very intuitive, and not everyone is, so that is definitely a strength for you. But I remember so specifically, it was a week after I, had gotten in trouble with the law and got a DUI and was really struggling, and you called me up and it was to talk about something else, and you're like, you don't sound right, and I just word vomited all over you. And you're like, all right, so here's the language I'm going to use. I'm going to do my best. And and you have the training to do it, but not everyone does. So I kind of want to go over what is the best avenue on how to deal with someone who's really emotionally fragile.
Well, I think part of it is making a change all of the time in the way we talk about things. I know people are really tired of what feels like political correctness and, feeling like they always have to edit themselves. But the reality is when we talk about certain issues in a derogatory way, it impacts everybody in the room, including the people that we have no idea are struggling. So, and this is true whether we're talking about suicide or substance use, if somebody's battling with a drug problem and they're at a social event and somebody refers to people with substance use disorders as junkies, how's that going to make that person who's struggling feel?
Right.
And so, it's going to make them feel terrible. And so, when we think about suicide, we don't want to glamorize or romanticize it, but we also don't want to make people feel judged. Right? So one of the examples that jumps out at me the most, because it's the most commonly used word probably to describe suicide, is the word committed. Most commonly you hear people say that someone committed suicide, and you see it in the media all the time. But you know what? If you think about it, what other things do people generally refer to as committed?
Marriage.
Well, you commit to marriage. Usually people, like when we say someone committed, we say they committed a crime, they committed infidelity, they committed a sin.
Yeah.
Right? So it's okay to commit to something, but it's different to say someone committed something.
Oh, that's interesting. I never thought about that.
Yeah, so we really encourage people to not use the word committed, because if you're using a word that feels as sort of loaded and judgmental as committed does, do you think somebody's more or less likely to open up and tell you that they're thinking about taking their life? they're less
No,
likely.
absolutely not.
We encourage people to just say that someone died by suicide.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I hear all the time is that it was a successful suicide. And I'm a little baffled by that because, of all the things that we want people to be successful at in life,
Suicide's
I
not
don't
one
think
of them.
suicide's on anyone's list.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then thinking about, like, the word, when somebody say it was a failed suicide attempt. One
Yeah.
thing that I learned watching somebody try to take her life for 6 years, she felt pretty horrible about every part of herself. And I don't think being told that she had failed at anything else was helpful at all.
Yeah.
So just thinking about, when we talk about suicide and a suicide attempt or a death, being mindful of the language that we're using.
Yeah.
Is really important. And I think this is true, too, when we talk about people with mental health issues. How often does somebody throw around the word, oh, he's mental, or he's crazy, or,
yeah.
And just to be sensitive. Because if somebody in the room is struggling, we could really make them feel even worse. And the issue is, Nikki, most people don't know that someone in the room is struggling.
Right. So I think there's so I think a lot of people are like, well, I'm sick of giving out a participation award, right? Like, or award. So somebody, kids go to the soccer game and everyone gets an award, and people are like, well, I'm pissed about that. People are showing up, they're getting awards. Well, I think that the majority of the population is not recognizing the fact that when people show up, they're showing up with stuff. And just showing up is really hard. And when people push past even being really hard, they're exceptional. And we live in a culture that really struggles with recognizing anything that's not really normal. And we like the idea of success stories, but when we can see it on Facebook, oh, look at this kid, he did really well, but then we have to celebrate in our community, we're like, now we got problems with it. In theory, we like success stories, but then we see it, like, in front of us, we have issues with it. So I think as a culture, we have such a long way to go.
Yeah, I think so, too.
Yeah.
I see progress. When I was a kid, bullying certainly existed, but I don't remember anyone ever talking about it. I feel like people are talking about bullying now.
Yeah.
And even the Me Too movement, a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
I certainly never heard anybody talk about sexual assault or those types, childhood sexual trauma as a kid, and now those are topics that people are talking about. And so I think progress is slow, but it's happening. And
I don't
I
don't even know if it's slow, but it goes at the pace of us.
Yeah.
It's not going to go any faster than we can comprehend it. But with that being said, the more information we can give people about struggles of one another, and I had posted, and me and Sara talked about this, I think last night. I had posted something about Sydney and her suicide, and a lot of the response was people like, don't take my guns away. I'm like, what? How is that even your response? A young woman she took her own life as a result of trauma, and her family has to deal with that, and your first thought is your guns, and that's being hypersensitive, and that's like these are the conversations we have to have, because in America we are very confused. I think about trauma, suicide, guns. I think we're very confused. I don't think we have the correct information, and I think a part of it, and Sara, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think part of it is pushed by the media.
Well, there's a lot of division in our country right now, and I feel like people get lost in that division, and often our most vulnerable people, like our children,
Yeah.
or people struggling with substance use issues or mental health problems. But I guess the saying is a come to Jesus moment, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like we need to have that and sort of decide what are the things that are really important to us as a country. But, I worry, Nikki, because, people tend to band together on issues and then, they go on social media and it's really easy to, be polarized with the way that the media operates, the way that social media is. And I feel like, and the research supports this. The more that we can get people in a room together to talk to each other, the more we would start to heal, some of these wounds. So it really becomes a question of how do we work to get people in the room together.
So what I hear is...
Go
ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead.
So today, I guess, at a Senate bill hearing, there was more people wearing the pearl necklaces for victims of gun violence. So what I'm hearing is we might need to get them on the show and have that conversation.
Yeah. I mean, and I don't think it's an angry conversation.
No.
If it's possible to have it. Because, I'm sure that these folks have their own sort of beliefs about it. But I can't help but wonder, do they know how hurtful those pearl necklaces are to people who have lost someone they love to gun violence?
Yeah.
And I hope the answer is no. I hope the answer is that they think people just get mad and that it's just political and that they don't really understand how hurtful it is. Because if you're a mother who's lost your child, that's just devastating.
But the thing is like, I think they would do it for guns, but if a mother walked up and said, my son died of a heroin overdose, I think they would I don't think they would do something like that. I think when it comes to guns, New Hampshire is very weird.
Well, I think that we have a lot of people in our country who, have served.
Yeah.
And that gets a little complicated because we put guns in their hands at 18 years old and send them, into war zones. And then they come home and they don't feel safe sometimes without their guns. And so I think it's a really complicated conversation.
So you worked with, we didn't talk about this, but I guess we could go down this road because I think it's a very important conversation. So you have worked extensively with veterans. So what does that look like in terms of veterans and suicide rate?
Well, here's the thing. When it comes to guns, we have to be very careful in the way that we talk about it because we want people to stay and listen.
Yep.
And yet, a suicide attempt involving a firearm has a fatality rate of 97%. Wow. Whereas if, we're talking about an overdose, it's about a 3% fatality rate. Yep. So, and of course there's people who go, well, if somebody's going to make an attempt, they're going to do it one way or the other, except our research shows us that 90% of people who make an attempt and survive it will never make another attempt. And so, that means that of all these people dying by suicide from firearms, had they used a different method and survived it, there's a really good chance they would not have ever made another attempt. And so we know that firearms really fuel the lethality of a suicide attempt. Mm-hmm. And so the way that I like to sort of approach it is actually not from the firearm conversation, but from, the perspective of if we knew that we had a teenager in our house who was suicidal, would we leave lots and lots and lots of medication in the medicine cabinet? Mm-hmm. And most people say right away, no, we'd move it.
Yep.
And I say, well, why would you do that? And they say, well, because it's just too easy, right? It's too easy if you have somebody who might be suicidal to have a cabinet full of something that could be dangerous to them. And I go, okay, well, what if we had a middle-aged man and he had a firearm in his drawer? And they don't want to admit that I'm right, but they know that I'm right. Mm-hmm. The answer is we want to try to get him to have somebody else take that firearm until he's no longer suicidal, right?
Right.
And so we talk a lot about means restriction, but it's one of the topics that's very important for me that doesn't become political.
Yeah.
That it's really about saving people's lives. So it's pretty tricky, but that's certainly a factor for our veterans is the access to firearms.
Do you find that talking about, and you work with many different law enforcements in your career, the moment you bring up suicide, which is your job, right? So you go in and you have these trainings with them, and I guess they're kind of prepped for the idea that you're going to talk about this stuff, but I know you, and you get to the point pretty quickly. And we talked about earlier that the biggest risk factor right now is middle-aged white men. When you go into these trainings and you get right to the point, do you find that they're shocked?
No, they know.
Why do you think they know?
They know. Because they're the ones who go to the calls.
Yeah.
So they know. And they also know that we're losing more police officers and firefighters to suicide than we are line of duty deaths. So no,
I just want you to repeat that one more time.
We are losing more firefighters and police officers in the United States to suicide than we are to line of duty deaths.
Yeah.
So no, they're not surprised by it. They know.
And that's them. That's their partners. That's their friends at work. And they go to work and they see it every day, and then they have to live with the fact that, their partner or their buddy at work could be dying of suicide.
Well, and that's why we're teaching them the same things that we're teaching the regular, community members, which is how do you recognize somebody? How do you know what the warning signs are?
Yep.
How do you know what the risk factors are? How do you know what the clues would look like? And if you see those things, how do you talk to them and ask them about suicide? Mm-hmm. How do you persuade them to stay alive first and then to accept help? And then how do you get them to that help? Yep. So it's a hour-long training called QPR, Question, Persuade, and Refer.
Yep.
And I train public safety all around the state of Massachusetts in it. So giving them the same tools so that they can help each other.
Can you repeat that one more time? QPR?
QPR is Question, Persuade, and Refer. It is a training model. You can look it up at the QPR Institute. And it stands for question, which is how do I ask somebody who might be thinking about suicide?
Yep.
The P is for persuade, so how do I persuade them to stay alive and get the help that they need? And the R is for refer, how do I get them to the help they need?
All right, so we have 8 minutes. So the next 8 minutes I want to use about resources. So one of the resources...
You actually have 5 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I have 5 minutes. One of the resources is the suicide prevention hotline right behind me. I don't really think you can see it fully. So the number is 1-800-273-8255. I will repeat. 1-800-273-8255. Sara, I know you have some resources you want to talk about.
Yeah, and if I can just add with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, they're an absolutely incredible organization. They do tremendous work throughout the nation. When you dial that number, it goes to people who are trained, very highly trained to be able to help. But not only can somebody who's, having thoughts of suicide call that number, but even if you're not having thoughts of suicide, you're just having a really hard time, you can call that number for support. And if you're a family member or a friend and you're... What's that?
And sometimes it doesn't even have to feel like suicide for it to be enough pain. So support,
right.
Like what you just said, support, call that number, have a conversation.
Yep. And if you're a friend or a family member and you're worried about somebody else, you can also call that number and they will give you guidance.
Yep.
So nobody should feel like they're alone Also, for veterans who might be listening, you dial the same number, but you press 1, and that will bring you to the Veterans Crisis Line. And those are mostly all veterans answering, not, I don't think 100%, but mostly. But they're also very well trained in the military and in working with veterans.
So
the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is a great resource.
So for veterans, it's 1-800-273-82551.
And you press 1.
Yep. You press 1. So one more time. 1-800, this is for veterans, 1-800-273-8255, press 1. That is for veterans.
Yep.
Do you have any other resources before I talk about your website and your books? Oh, we have 3 minutes.
Oh, I also want you to know that you have an organization called New Hampshire NAMI, National Alliance for the Mentally Ill.
Yep, so New Hampshire NAMI.
Yeah.
Yep.
You guys have some really amazing folks out there, so definitely check them out.
Yep.
I have the honor of working with them at national conferences, and they are really, really dedicated people.
Yeah. New Hampshire NAMI, which is for mental health issues, they're very engaged. They are all over the state. The people who run it are really incredible. For the lack of resources in New Hampshire, they have really strong people to kind of balance that out. So we have like a minute left. Sara, so I want you to be able to kind of talk about your website and what you're doing. Go ahead.
So I often hear in my work people say, I just don't understand how somebody can get to that point, meaning the point of suicide. And I've heard it so many times that I actually decided to write a book. It's a novel that is intended to illustrate how somebody can get to that point. And it's actually about a police officer. It is hopefully, fingers crossed, going to be published in the next few weeks. And the title of that is The Price.
The Price.
And The Price. And my website, we're still developing it, but it is Sara Gaer, SARAHGAER.
So SARA, I'm just going to say it one more time, SARAHGAER.com.
That's right. And that actually has another book that I'm really excited. We're supposed to be publishing that one in a few weeks as well. That's called The Guts, Grit, and the Grind, the Mental Fitness Manual.
Yep.
And that is a book written by more than 40 men. We even have men from Australia in our book, all talking about how they've overcome issues in their life, ranging from, relationship problems to just health, dealing with their own health problems, loss, trauma, everything. It's an amazing book. So hopefully that will be going to publishing very soon as well.
And I think, you know what? Right before you have your kids' book published, we're going to have you on the show. I just decided. So I have 30 seconds left. So, Sara, I just want to thank you so much for you dedicating an hour without anything coming your way. It was just, you just care. And that's why I consider you one of my best friends, and I'm really grateful for you. So,